Welcome, everyone, and thanks for attending the second in our research series about topics pertaining to research. I'm especially pleased today to introduce Andrea Mohr. Many of you know her as Andrea Bedanzet. She's now going by her maiden name, same person. She's done that navigating the research process at Carilion Clinic. Andrea is a graduate of William and Mary and also a graduate of Jefferson College's Health Science with a Master's in Health Administration. She's been in her current role for 6 years, starting in 2016. And during her time, we've doubled the amount of clinical trials that we're doing at Carilion Clinic. So she's pretty much the resident expert about anything to do with clinical trial work. So Andrea, I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Farrell. And I think you said maiden name, but it's actually my married name is Andrea Mohr. So just to clarify that. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We are going to be talking about the research process at Carilion. There's a lot of information to cover, so I'll go ahead and jump in. Let me just get my slide to advance. Let's see. Okay. So our objectives today are that participants will have a clear understanding of research review and approval at Carilion. They'll be aware of the resources available to support their research endeavors, and they'll be aware of the different entities at Carilion that are responsible for research oversight. So we're going to start off talking about our research support resources, navigating the approval process and the various groups that you'll work with when you're going through that. Research oversight at Carilion, and then SOPs for clinical research. So just some background information for those of you who don't know. We are an academic medical center. We have over 400 human subjects research studies, including over 100 clinical trials in 16 different therapeutic areas. The Research and Development Department facilitates, supports, and administers all research at Carilion Clinic. And as our research portfolio continues to expand, we want to make sure that our current and future researchers are educated on research processes and that their endeavors are successful. So I wanted to start out with a poll just to see what people's previous experience is with research. So if you want to go ahead and select all that apply, if you've worked on a retrospective study at Carilion, a prospective study, an industry-sponsored clinical trial, a grant-funded project, or a study with an external collaborator. So I'll give everybody a few minutes to select your answers. All right, do we have any results in yet?
We have, I think we've got all the answers. Oh, no, a couple answers still.
Still coming in? All right, I'll be patient.
All right, I'll go ahead and end the poll.
Okay. All right, so it looks like we have people with lots of different experience. We've got 61% who've worked on retrospective studies, 61% prospective studies, 61% industry sponsored, 50% grant funded, and then 56% who've had an external collaborator. So that's good to know as we move through. I can decide which areas need a little more focus and which just need a brief overview. For some reason, my slides are sticking a little bit. There we go. Okay. So starting out, our clinical research support services. So if people are not familiar with the R&D office, we have several different people in different areas that support all things research. So we do research contracting. This could be confidentiality agreements, grant awards, clinical trial agreements, and so forth. We support budget development and negotiations. We have regulatory affairs support, clinical research personnel. We administer all the finances for sponsored projects, and we also have the basic science lab. And so I have entered a link here in the slides. You can click on this. This will take you to our website, and it goes into detail into all the different support services we have to offer. So don't hesitate to reach out if you are curious about what we can do to help you with your projects. So like I said, these are available to researchers to reduce the burden on our research investigators and their teams. So if you have an idea for a project, you're not sure where to start, we have an email inbox. You can send an email there, research@carilionclinic.org, and we can give you a consultation. So we always tell people, reach out to us early in the process, because there might be a lot of things that you can do to streamline your project and make the approval process much smoother. So please feel free to reach out and contact us if you have any questions as you're getting started with a new project. So jumping into the specific approval process, all research projects at Carilion do require R&D approval, and some also require IRB approval or conflict of interest disclosure. If you have a basic science project, that might need to go through the Institutional Biosafety Committee. And then with that, there's some required training from R&D, OIC, and the IRB. So I'll get into more detail on that. I put together, oh, sorry, was there a question? No, okay. I put together a chart just to make it easy to follow which types of approvals are needed for which projects. So R&D approvals required for all projects. The mechanism to do this is through a REDCap application. And the details there, you'd submit the R&D REDCap application. We would route it to your department leader for approval of the project idea and staff time, and then we'll review it and approve and provide feedback, or a feasibility meeting might need to be held, and then approval will follow that. For conflict of interest, this is just for funded projects. It is submitted through the Smart COI disclosure platform, and this is in order to manage or mitigate any potential conflicts with your project. And then lastly is IRB. So this is required for all human subjects research. Your submissions would go through PRISM, which is an iMedris platform, and then projects that meet the criteria of human subject research. And this includes those that would need an exemption determination. And then beyond that, if you have what you think is a QA/QI project, you can also submit this to the IRB to get that official determination. And a lot of journals will require this, so I always like to point that out. All right, so that's your basic overview of the approvals and how to obtain them. So for required training, most of you are probably familiar with the city modules. These are available through the cityprogram.org website. For human subjects research projects, then we always would require you would have biomedical researchers course. And then if you're doing something that's FDA regulated or has NIH funding, we also recommend that you do the good clinical practice module. There's also a conflict of interest module if you have externally supported projects. So then beyond those, R&D offers some additional optional modules. There's a module on grant proposal development, research administration, clinical trial billing compliance, research coordination, and then biosafety and biosecurity. And if you take these modules and you still feel like you need additional training, we're happy to meet with you and give you one-on-one training by request. And again, you can just contact research@carilionclinic.org for anything along those lines. So I mentioned that the R&D application is required for all new projects. So this is a very brief application that's done through REDCap. Takes about 10 to 15 minutes to complete. It has electronic signatures, and we will route it automatically to your leader to get that sign off. So when we receive this, we're looking at, did you get your leader approval? Do we need study personnel assignments? Is a feasibility meeting needed? And then it can also trigger the contracting and budgeting process. So I've included some screenshots here, just walking through what the R&D application looks like. I will not go through this line by line, but just to give you a basic overview, when you pull this up, you're going to be entering some basic project information about the PI, the position at Carilion, contact information, study personnel, what type of project you're doing, what the funding source is. You can request an R&D research coordinator here if you need one, and then providing your requests if you need any ancillary services. So this is a great time to identify whether you need support from someone outside your department. So those could be health analytics, the lab, imaging, pharmacy, what have you. So always want to flag those items in the R&D application so that when we receive your completed application, we know who to include in that feasibility meeting and review so that we can get their approval early in the process. That's one of those items that really helps streamline the review and approval. It's getting these things identified early. And then you can include an abstract or protocol. If you have a budget that you've drafted, you can upload it here. If not, you can just ask us to help you put together a budget. That's part of those central services we offer. And then there's lines for signatures. So like I said, we will review these and provide feedback if needed. We'll also schedule a feasibility meeting if that's needed. And if neither of these are needed, we'll go ahead and issue your approval letter. And so when you get your approval letter, this has to be included in your IRB submission. And the IRB will not approve something unless it has received the R&D approval first. So just to touch on conflict of interest a little bit, let you know some of the details around that. If you do not have external funding on your project, you do not need to do a conflict of interest disclosure. This applies to, like, with our research overhead funds. If it's being funded by that, that does not count as external funding. Also, if it's a medical student project and the only external funds are the medical student research funds that they have, that does not count as external support. You just want to note that in your application. So if you do have an externally supported study that does require COI, this should be disclosed annually in the SMART COI process that goes out. I think it usually comes out each fall. And then if there are any changes to that, so if you have a new funding relationship with an external entity, you want to disclose that within 30 days of that new relationship so that your disclosures can be updated and these can be mitigated. If you do have a COI, that does not necessarily mean you can't do a project. It just means it needs to be reviewed and addressed. Oftentimes they'll put a statement in the consent form that a relationship is present, and we just want to disclose that to participants so they're aware of that relationship. So when you've submitted to the IRB, after you've gotten your R&D approval, you're going to start that application in PRISM. The IRB will do the COI check if you have external funding. They'll also do a privacy data security review. And once the study is submitted, it will be routed again to the department leader. So the department leader is looking at it at those 2 time points. First, when it's just that initial project idea for R&D, and then when it's fully fleshed out, submitted to the IRB, ready to get that final approval. So Carilion Clinic's IRB reviews all human subjects research. They can provide the QA/QI determinations, and they can also give exemptions if it doesn't meet the criteria for human subjects research. When we're working with industry sponsors, there's a slightly different process. We would still submit to the Carilion Clinic IRB. They would look at safety matters, vulnerable populations, and research personnel, but then we can often use what's called a central IRB or a commercial IRB to be the IRB of record. So the ones we frequently work with are Advara or WCG. And then other commercial IRBs may be considered for industry-sponsored trials on a per-project basis. So when the IRB is looking at your project, they will review your submission and provide feedback. It may meet the criteria for expedited review, and it can be reviewed without convening the full board of the IRB. If it does meet criteria for full board, it will be brought before a review committee for discussion with the investigator and the study team. And once the review is completed and the application is determined to be acceptable, they will grant your approval and the project can then begin enrollment and data collection. So this is in large font and bold because it's very important that you know any changes to your study protocol, personnel, or study materials, especially something like the informed consent form or protocol procedures, that must be approved by the IRB before you implement those changes. So this is one of the big takeaways from the talk today. Always make sure if you're changing your study, you need to submit it to the IRB and get those changes approved. So I've included some links at the bottom here. There's the link to the iMedris application, and there's also the link to the processes for the IRB for new submissions. So definitely follow these to get more information there if you are interested in learning more about this. So I always want to point out when I'm talking about the approval process at Carilion, a lot of people I'm sure are listening to this and saying, well, why do we have to go through both of these approvals? What is the point of that? What's the difference between IRB approval and R&D approval? Why are these both necessary? So the IRB is reviewing the studies to ensure that research meets federal regulations, institutional policies, ethical standards. They're also looking at a favorable risk-benefit ratio, subject selection, consent procedure. So that's the aspect that the IRB is mostly concerned with. R&D is more concerned with the operational aspects of research. So billing compliance, contracting and budgeting, feasibility analysis, and personnel assignments. So because we're looking at different areas and different concerns about the project, that's why these two review processes are required. So just to sum that up, the IRB approves studies that are determined to be ethical and meet federal regulations, including the risk-benefit ratio, and R&D will approve studies if they're feasible for the organization. We then process the necessary agreements, do the builds, and set up accounts for study activation. So ethical, risk-benefit, all of those things lie with the IRB. Operational aspects lie with R&D. So I've mentioned feasibility meetings a couple times already. I just wanted to go into a little bit more detail about which projects require those. Any study that prospectively enrolls patients and involves an intervention will have a feasibility meeting scheduled. So examples of that would be drug, device, a research procedure that's being studied. If you are doing a survey study, an observational study, or a retrospective study, those would not require feasibility meetings. We just want to look at the studies that have that prospective enrollment and an intervention to make sure that we can support them. So what do we discuss at our feasibility meetings and why is that important? So I mentioned when I was going over the R&D application, we want to get approval from those ancillary departments. So if you need lab services, if you need imaging services or pharmacy, they need to sign on to this project. We can't just execute a contract, initiate a project, and tell them after the fact. That's not going to go well. So we always want to talk about that early on and get their approval through that feasibility review. We'll also talk about the coverage analysis. So what that means is when you're looking at a study protocol, which of those elements are paid for by the study and are solely being completed for research purposes, and which could be considered routine care and billed out to the participant. This is very critical that we identify these items right from the start so that we don't have billing issues down the line. We're also going to look at developing the budget through the feasibility meeting. We'll talk about, based on the coverage analysis, how will we budget for this project? We will start the contract review. So I work with legal to review all research contracts and make sure that the terms we're agreeing to are reasonable. We want to look at the flow of the study schedule of events, make sure it is feasible for our site. So, an example I could give here is if you had a study that requires labs at 4 time points, and the clinic where the patients would be seen or the study participants would be seen doesn't have a lab in that building, that's going to be an issue whether we can make that happen or not, because that would make a lot of travel back and forth for the participants. So these are the types of things we're looking at the feasibility assessment to see if it makes sense to sign on to a project. We might also ask that you run a report or ask the HARP team to run a report in Trinetics to make sure we have an appropriate patient population. And then lastly, just discussing any obstacles that would keep us from being successful. So switching gears just a little bit, we've talked a little bit about industry-sponsored trials, what those look like. You may also be involved in working on grants, which are still externally funded, but they're usually funded by nonprofit agencies or the federal government. You might have an NIH grant or a state grant from the Virginia Department of Health. Those types of things would fall under this grant process. So you'll probably notice a trend here. You still want to notify R&D as soon as you plan on submitting an extramural application. We have a grants management administrator. She will work with your study team to prepare the budget, gather the appropriate documentation, and determine requirements for submission. If you have external collaborators, so people who are not employed by Carilion who will be working on the project, we want to get letters of commitment and budgets from them to confirm their participation. And we also still ask that you have the R&D application completed and approved by your department leader. And this should be done before you submit the grant package. So grants that involve prospective patient enrollment with research intervention will also require the feasibility meetings. And this needs to happen before we submit to the funding agency. And depending on the grant type, they may also require that IRB approval takes place before the contract. So this differs a little bit from the industry-sponsored trial process, because with those, we tend to execute the contract and then obtain IRB approval, where some grants will want that IRB approval to occur first before the contract is executed. If the grant is awarded, the agreement and contract will be negotiated by R&D, and then the study will be submitted to the IRB if it has not already been done in pre-award. So we like to put out these deadlines, and these are in place to make sure that we have the best chance of getting the grant award. So we want everything organized well in advance of that submission deadline, so that we increase our opportunity of getting grant funding at our organization. So we ask that the budget and budget justification gets submitted to the grants management administrator 10 business days prior to the submission deadline. And then if we do have collaborators that are external to Carilion, we want those in at least 5 business days before the submission deadline. And then as we're getting closer to that submission date, about 3 business days ahead of time, R&D will perform a complete final proposal review, checking all those last details to make sure everything looks good. And then with 1 business day leading up to the deadline, we will submit to the funding agency for review. So I've mentioned contracts a few times already as well. Just want to make sure everyone is clear that Carilion Clinic does not permit investigators to sign research contracts on behalf of the organization. All research-related contracts must be reviewed centrally by R&D and then signed by our institutional research officer. And so for those of you who've been around for a while, this used to be Dr. Harrington, who was the VP for Academic Affairs. He recently retired, and Dr. Tressman has been appointed our new institutional research officer. So you'll see his name on all of our research contracts going forward. The one caveat to this, you might see contracts where the investigator or the physician is asked to sign the contract to acknowledge the terms. That's okay. We think that's fine, and it's good so that they're aware of what's in the contract, but they're not considered a party to the contract and they are not binding the organization. That is solely with Dr. Tressman for research contracts. All right, so research oversight at Carilion. So there's a couple different departments within Carilion that are responsible for research oversight. So we have research and development, that's our department. OIC, this is organizational integrity and compliance, and the IRB. So we all share this responsibility, and each of these departments can conduct quality reviews or study audits to ensure that researchers are following organizational policies or SOPs and federal regulations. So I always say, when in doubt, reach out to us. Any of these departments can help you if you have questions about your research projects and aren't sure what the best path forward should be. It's always better to ask questions than to just make assumptions that lead to mistakes down the road. So I think all of you, if you have any exposure to clinical research, you know it's a heavily regulated field. So we don't want to just be cavalier about what we can and can't do. We want to make sure we're following those regulations and policies and SOPs. So Just wanted to highlight, we do have a catalog of standard operating procedures for clinical trials. I have a link here. This will take you to our intranet page. There's about 40 different SOPs that are active. So it's a lot of material to cover, but if you read the SOPs, they will truly walk you through how to operate a clinical trial at Carilion from start to finish. So it's a resource we spent a lot of time developing, and I think it's rich with a lot of useful information. So if you do have time to look those up, I think it will benefit you in your research endeavors going forward. So these are standard operating procedures we put together. They provide specific guidance to our investigators. They increase compliance, reduce errors, and allow our new investigators to learn the proper way to conduct clinical research. And then when we wrote these, we based them on federal regulations, FDA guidance, and then our local best practices as well. So again, there's a link here that'll take you to that catalog of SOPs. All right, so I thought we could do some case studies to make this a little bit more interactive as we wrap up the lecture part of this. So the first case study is a colleague from an external institution approaches you to collaborate on a grant-funded clinical trial. You are interested in participating. What is your next step? A, contact R&D via email to notify the grants administrator of your plans and submit the R&D application for approval. B, the principal investigator reviews and signs subaward agreement from the primary institution. Or C, you submit the study application in PRISM for IRB approval. And yep, okay, there it is. All right, so if you answered the question, you should have received whether your response was correct or not, but I will go ahead and let y'all know that the correct response was to contact R&D via email to notify the grants administrator of your plans and submit the R&D application for approval. So like I said, there's a theme in this presentation. Contact us early, and that will help make the process go smoother. Any questions about that before I move to the next case study? All right, I will proceed to the next one then. Okay, so number 2. You have a project idea to review your patient population's medical records from the past 2 years to compare hospitalization rates for patients who were vaccinated against COVID-19 and those who were not vaccinated. So the first question is, would this type of project require a feasibility assessment? And then the second question is, would it require IRB review? So I'll give you all a minute to select that. And I forgot to ask this on the first case study, but are you all able to tell me the percentage of correct responses?
Oh, sure. For the first case study?
Sure, that's fine. And then we'll do this one.
Actually, I don't think I'm sharing the results from case study number 2. Can you see those?
I do not see it. If you're just able to say it out loud for us.
Okay, well, for case study number 2,
Mhm.
the correct answer for number 1 was B, or no. It does not require a feasibility assessment. And the correct answer for number 2 about IRB review is yes. We
And
had
does it
76 get number 1 correct, and 96% got number 2 correct.
All right, great, pretty good. So like Heather said, for the first question, would it require a feasibility assessment? The answer is no. And that's because it's a retrospective review. There's no intervention, nothing like that, where we'd need to check with other departments, make sure it's okay that we do this type of work. So that one is no. But just because it doesn't require feasibility does not mean it doesn't require IRB review. So we're still looking at participant charts. We'd need a HIPAA waiver, a consent waiver. So there'd still need to be review from the IRB to make sure this is an acceptable project to move forward.
And Andrea, you'll be happy to know that our stellar group here on case study number 1 got 100% correct.
All right, very good. Thank you. All right, last one. So number 3 is an industry sponsor sends a confidentiality agreement and protocol synopsis to you for an upcoming phase 2 investigational drug trial. You would like to review the full protocol before deciding to participate. So for the first question, who reviews confidentiality agreements for clinical trials? Is this Carilion's corporate counsel, Carilion's research and development, or Carilion's corporate contracts? And then second is, who is permitted to sign research-related contracts on behalf of Carilion? Is this the principal investigator, the director of clinical trials, or the institutional research officer?
Answers are still coming in.
All right.
And I'll go ahead and close. Oh, no, a couple more. People still thinking. All right, I'll go ahead and end the poll.
Okay.
For number 1, the correct answer was B, and 61% got correct. For number 2, the correct answer was C, and 82% got it correct.
All right. Yes. So again, anything research related, that's a contract, confidentiality agreements, grant awards, clinical trial agreements, anything like that that is related to research will come to the R&D office. I do work with legal to get these approved, but first they would come to us for that initial review. And then sounds like everybody was listening when I said that the institutional research officer is the one who can sign off on these contracts. So again, that's Dr. Tressman now, and you'll see his name on our research contracts going forward. So that is the end of my presentation. We have a little bit of time left, so I thought we could open it up if people have questions or anything specific they wanted to discuss.
Andrea, can I just make a comment, please?
Sure.
As chair of the IRB for a while, I can say that we do look at, I made a comment in the chat about this. We do look at feasibility because feasibility also has to do with ethical application of a research project. The other thing beyond the issues, because we do function independently, as you know, and one of the things we do look at, and there are a couple of these right now pending, we look at design of the study because that directly relates to ethical application of a research project as well. And we don't have a way of looking at design otherwise right now. We don't have a separate subcommittee at this point. That's going to have to happen, I think, over time. As research becomes more amplified here and more sophisticated, frankly. So just those couple of comments, because we do spend a lot of time looking over. We've got one project this week I've probably put 8 to 10 hours into, and they're still working on redesigning things. So
yes. Thank you, Dr. Schlupner. Yeah, I mean, that's so important to have all those different perspectives coming in to review these projects because they're complicated. We want to make sure our participants are protected, that, you know, it's worth doing the project that's been presented. So I appreciate that, Dr. Schlupner. Anything else?
I have a question. I'm Dr. Lee. This question is a little bit outside of the talk here, but are there any means of getting folks together who might be interested in doing research in terms of available projects? Faculty members, that is. I think the medical students have, you know, access to that, but some faculty members might not. They might be interested, but not really have access to projects.
Yeah, and I may put Dr. Farrell on the spot in a moment because I know he's doing some work in that regard, but currently a lot of it happens just through our interactions and people making those connections behind the scenes. But Dr. Farrell, if you want to talk about some of the work that you and the innovation group are doing to bridge these connections better going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Yeah, Dr. Lee, just contact the research office and we can find somebody that could work with you if you have an idea, or vice versa. One of the things that Andrea's alluding to is right now, Hal Urban and Aileen Hazel are working on getting together a formalized structure for getting the Department of Engineering at Virginia Tech to work with Carilion Clinic physicians. So stay tuned for that if you're interested in doing that. We're going to have a preliminary meeting in the fall and then a more formal either half day or full day meeting in the spring.
Thank you.
Dr. Lee, this is Dr. Bancoli from rheumatology. Dr. Michael Vitt actually just spoke to me on Friday with a really, really good idea. He has a repository for internal medicine residents that he's creating of people who are interested in research. And that way around, residents can reach out directly. There isn't anything that I'm aware of for the faculty, but things like that. I mean, if you forward your name and project ideas to him, you know, he will be able to connect you with learners that are interested and probably even faculty members.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
if I can make a comment, Kabenga, you know, one of the things in medicine in particular is we have mentorship matters, and the faculty mentors are supposed to be working with the mentees. And I, for one, just did that last night on suggesting how to access potential research projects or scholarly productivity. What you mentioned that Mike Vitt's trying to do, that'd be great. And certainly for the residents, and hopefully the faculty mentorship program that medicine has started will facilitate that further.
That's very well said, Charlie.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, and feel free to unmute to ask your questions, or if you want to post something in the chat, I'm happy to relay it over to Andrea.
I have a general comment. If you'd like to have any of your studies highlighted in our newsletter, or if you have anything you want to contribute, if you notice, we've been putting this out on a monthly basis, and we're always looking for study content. And then again, just send it to research@carillionclinic.org.
And if you'd rather ask something offline, I've put up some contacts here. So our general research at CarilionClinic.org, that comes to R&D, and we will route it to the appropriate person. Research compliance, this is OIC. They also have an inbox where they monitor research compliance questions. And then lastly, the IRB. So they can also review questions, anything you want to send in. So please don't hesitate to contact any of us and we'll try to help you through your questions. So if there isn't anything else, I just want to thank you all for your time today and hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much, Andrea. We really appreciate that. I know that there was a lot of information for folks, but I know Andrea's happy to answer questions offline if you'd like to reach out. Our next session will be October 20th, and that will be with Maddie Tenzer from the Heart Team, talking about all the services that the Heart Team offers. So make sure to share that with your colleagues and your residents and fellows, or anyone who's interested in engaging in research throughout the system. So, and then also there is a brief evaluation form that's been shared in the chat. So make sure that you complete that, especially if you need CME credit. So thank you guys so much for joining us today. And thank you, Andrea, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.